Hello everyone, it's Matt Koza, and my topic is war movies and how they have changed over time. This video is going to mainly cover war films and how violence and gore has increased in these films over the years. We will also be discussing the sociological implications that violence and gore have on war films and how the audience can perceive those things. The article I'm going to be using is an article called A Content Analysis of Violence in American War Films, written by Elizabeth Monk Turner and her collaborators, and this article measures levels of violence and gore in war films using a coding scheme. This is the chart we'll be using to analyze these war films. So there's the earlier period, as you can see under the movie title area, which is from 1970s to the 1980s, those decades, and then the later period of the 90s and the early 2000s. As you can see up top, there's the incidents of violence, and they have hand, blades, primary weapons, small weapons, artillery, and bombs. There's the length of the violence, and then there's the gore scale. And we will be using this chart to help us figure out how violent and gory these films are and if they have increased from the earlier period to the later period. Through Monk Turner's research, they figured out that violence and gore has increased over the years, and a quote they have is, "Although there was approximately the same number of gory scenes and battles between the decades, the graphic intensity of these scenes increased over times. We also found a significant difference in the percentage of time devoted to violence in movies of the 90s and 2000s compared to those of the 70s and the 80s. There is a higher content of violence in more recent movies. Not only did our findings show that the amount of violence has increased over the decades, our study shows that the graphic nature of violence has increased in intensity as well." So if we go back and reference our chart, we can see here that in the gore section, if we look at a film, for example, from the earlier period, Full Metal Glory, we can see that in the scale section of the gore, it got a 33. And then we go down to the later period, we can see the numbers have increased dramatically, with Saving Private Ryan getting a 527. Now we can relate everything back to sociology using Durkheim's structural functionalist framework using manifest and latent functions. And we're going to be using Saving Private Ryan for these examples. So, for example, the manifest function of Saving Private Ryan would be to entertain an audience. That's the goal of any movie in general, is to always entertain the audience, but also show the horrors of war. And I will be showing you a video from the director, Steven Spielberg, about what this movie really meant to him and what it was meant to do, which is its manifest function.
Saving Private Ryan was never meant to be thrilling. It was never meant to be an adventure. It was meant to be a recreation, a kind of a documentation of the closest I could get to the experiences of those who fought there on June 6th.
Now we can look at the latent functions of Saving Private Ryan, and a latent function is something that was an unintended effect, while a manifest function is something that was intended. So the latent function of Saving Private Ryan would be that the film gave many veterans PTSD. For veterans that fought on the beach during D-Day, when they saw that scene in the movie, it was so accurate and realistic that it actually gave them PTSD. So that obviously wasn't the intended function of the scene, but due to its realistic nature, that was a latent function. And it also desensitizes viewers to media violence, which is a huge trend that we've been seeing. Obviously, we looked at our chart and we saw that in the 70s and 80s, the violence was much more toned down, and it had a huge increase when we went to the 90s and 2000s period. So we can clearly see that viewers became desensitized and the violence needed to increase to keep them engaged. And we can connect all this to the sociological imagination, which is dealing with personal problems and public issues. So a personal problem would be something that you deal with on the inside. It's something personal to you, not to anyone else. So say we use Joe, for example. Joe was a World War II veteran, and he saw Saving Private Ryan, and the realistic portrayals of war gave him PSD. That would be a personal problem to just Joe, no one else. So, and then a public issue, on the other hand, is something that affects a large group of people or a community, and that would be the depicts realistic portrayals of war and exposes them to what really happens on the battlefield, and it does not glorify it. Since it is realistic, it doesn't show only the good guys winning. It shows that there's death on both sides. Good guys and bad guys die, and on D-Day especially, a lot of people died, and it does a really good job of showing that viewers have clearly become desensitized to media violence over the years, and we can see that it's evident from the earlier period that we looked at from the chart, and then the later period with movies like Saving Private Ryan. And I think that has even increased today. Viewers have become so desensitized to this media violence that we can get films like Hacksaw Ridge, which I think takes it a step above Saving Private Ryan. But we can also get more, whimsical films and more fantasy films, such as like the horror genre, which is has extremely gory and violent scenes. And if we look at stuff like, for example, Suicide Squad, there's literally a scene where someone gets ripped in half, like it's very violent. So violence has been increasing over the years, and it will continue to do so based on the research Elizabeth Monk Turner did. And whether that's a good thing or not is really up to the viewer. And I don't think this increase in media violence is necessarily a bad thing. I think it could be a good thing since it depicts realistic portrayals of war, which is an important thing to show. And it doesn't over glorify it either. When you over glorify it, it just kind of ruins the whole message behind it and just makes it a feel good film when it should really be depicting what actually happens in these battles. So, whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, it's really up to you to decide. Thank you for listening to my video on war movies and how they have changed over time and the sociological implications that go along with those changes.